A break?
Yeah, there was a break the past 10 minutes.
Well.
Okay, so I hope we can continue, and I would like to introduce first the respondent and then the final speaker. So our respondent will be James Poskett. He's welcome, James, by the way. He's assistant professor in the history of science and technology at the University of Warwick. And before joining Warwick, he completed his PhD at the University of Cambridge and held the Adrian Research Fellowship at Darwin College, Cambridge. His research concerns the global history of science and technology from about 1750 to today. His first book, Materials of the Mind, Phrenology, Race, and the Global History of Science, was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2019. And later this year, I believe, his new book, Horizons, A Global History of Science, will be published by Penguin UK. And he will respond to a talk by Kapil Raj, and he is professor of the history of science at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and he has published widely on the history of natural history, social statistics, and geography in the context of the European encounter with South Asia from the 16th century to today. And his writings put particular emphasis on the role of cultural circulations and interactions in the formation and transformation of scientific knowledge. And the central thesis of his seminal book, Relocating Modern Science, Circulation and the Making of Knowledge in South Asia and Europe, is that circulation must be studied as a central concept in the historical analysis of the construction of naturalistic, geographical, linguistic, and social ideas. So we very much look forward to hearing your talk, Kapil, and to hear from James, his comment on your talk afterwards, and of course, your contribution to the plenary discussion following it. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lucas. Thank you for inviting me for this to this workshop. And well, so let's start without more, any further ado. I've been trying to. Can you all see my my screen?
It's still loading. Yeah, we can see your screen.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
We see it in a small. I think you have to make this full screen mode, if it's possible.
It is in full screen mode for me.
Okay, now it's for us as well. So good to go.
I haven't done anything.
Okay, well, maybe it just was loading, so now it's okay.
Yeah, okay. So, well, I've titled my talk for a global history of science. Now, the for is not towards, it's what one needs to do to have a global history of science. So it's a new playing field, new goalposts, new rules, and I'll end with an example. So anyway, I'd just like to mention one thing, which is that although today's workshop is entitled Debating New Approaches to the Histories of the Sciences, sorry, I made a mistake there. I consciously opted to use science in the singular for two main reasons. Firstly, the sciences in the plural refer to the multiplicity of scientific disciplines which have arisen in the course of the past 2 centuries, and can't take a broader view of things if we're going to talk about the histories of the sciences. We're talking about something which deals just with 2 centuries. I think one needs to go beyond that, especially in light of the other, this onslaught of, or this argument for the history of knowledge. And what that wants to cover. So one of the things I would plead for, at least in my talk, is to talk about it in the singular. And secondly, I mean, it's precisely during this very same period of these 200 years that science, again in the singular, but with a capital S, has arisen to become the principal arbiter of every aspect of human life, defining what is natural and what is rational. To perhaps become the most, and this is to borrow from what Jim Secord said this morning, the most powerful form of expertise in today's world. And it's in this sense that that I also want to talk about this history of science in this way. So let me start by saying just one thing, which is that the history of science, in spite of the fact that we're talking about the global turn, we have been recently in the past few decades, and not only in the history of science, but in history in general. And there's a rising number of articles, special issues of learned journals and books, international conferences, and so on on this theme. And ISIS alone, for instance, has published at least 3 of its focus sections since 2004 on this idea of global themes in the history of science. So, and there are more and more books on this subject. So I would like, in fact, to come back to something, which is that it's as if the global turn is something new. But I would submit that the history of science, no matter how much it sort of put forward a view of European superiority, has ever since its inception had for its object a global perspective, which has changed over the last century. So let's go back to the origins of the history of science as an emerging discipline at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, the point here is that when you look at this journal, you find right from the beginning that it has a comité de patronage, an editorial board. And in this editorial board, although we find people of, mainly from Europe, there are still a number of people who come from elsewhere. To see just 2 of them, over here to cite just 2 of them. One is Prafulla Chandra Ray, professor of chemistry at Presidency College in Calcutta. And the other one is Jorge Engerand, who's the director of the International School of Archaeology and American Archaeology and Ethnography in Mexico City. Now, in setting this journal up, certain sort of, he tries to make his, sort of give an image of history of the sciences, which include everything from, of course, mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, mechanics, but also archaeology, ethnology, geography, medicine, the occult sciences, Buddhism, Tantrism, navigational astronomy, commercial arithmetic, cookery, arts and crafts, etc. And so right from the beginning, we have this idea of science as being something very broad. Now, although it's aimed at for scientists, and in order for them to get a better idea of the past of their own disciplines and the past of their own practices, it still thinks that these practices, at least puts forward a conception of these practices as coming from all over the world and different ways, in fact, of getting to these knowledges from other parts and their practices from other parts of the world meant that you had to use archaeology and ethnology and so on. And all these are then also part of science because these are the tools through which one acquires knowledge of the past, so of others. So there is this notion, and sorry. And you find that if you look through the contents pages of the first issues, even till about the 1930s, you find just a number of articles coming from all kinds of places. Of course, not written only in English, but also in German, Italian, French, and I don't have time to go through all this, but anyway, you can see this list. And Sarton himself says the progress of science is not due to the isolated efforts of a single people, but to the combined efforts of all peoples. And this is the idea of the new humanism. So this is one way of looking at the history of looking at science, which is science. It's global, of course. In this, he's not naive. He's not a dupe. He does think that European science, modern science, is superior to others, but this is only something that happened in the last 300 years. And it's a part of the zeitgeist of the time. If you read any of the other friends of his, they all share this view. And even Whitehead at one point in his famous lectures given in 1925 says the home of science is the whole world. It is transferable from country to country and from race to race, wherever there is a rational society. And he says it can be passed from west to east without wanton destruction of the other's own inheritance, which they so rightly prize. So, sorry. So that's his the idea, and this carries on till about 1930 or thereabouts. And then there's something new that happens, which is the introduction of Russian revolutionaries into the scene of the history of science. I'm not going to go into the history of this, but two things happen. Number one, Boris Hessen's intervention at the International Congress for the History of Science in 1931, where his paper, The Social and Economic Roots of Newton's Principia, changes a lot. And everyone's talked about all the changes that this paper brings about and the revolution that occurs in the history of science's understanding of science. But one of the things that it also does is that it locates science now. I mean, it's not everywhere that science or modern science takes root. It takes root in Northwestern Europe, especially in Britain, with the rise of capitalism. So this has to do with a historical movement. It has to do with the sheer break with the past. And it is here that one should then be interested, looking at this space, that one should be talking about the history of science. The next Russian revolutionary is Alexandre Koyré, who in 1939, again, invents this idea of the scientific revolution, which is a conceptual change in the way in which we think of science. And here again, this change happens in Europe. And from here, and also not only does it happen in Europe, but it happens in certain fields of human intellectual practice, which is what science then becomes. And that it has to do with mathematics, and it has to do with physics. So this is Etude Galilean. And from here onwards, the whole field of the history of science changes. This is 1939. Koire goes to the US, and in part because of his own teachings in Princeton, but also in part the effect that his own encounters with people have, is that the idea of the history of the scientific revolution comes out as being the way in which the whole discipline is going to be reformulated after the Second World War. It's quite, and the scientific revolution is what does it. So here are the, and these are the books in English which actually shape the subject. So Butterfield's Origins and Rupert Hall's Scientific Revolution, especially Rupert Hall's Scientific Revolution. And from here onwards, the whole idea is, and that science then is the defining feature, modern science or science is then the defining feature of the West. And it's, in a strange way, historians of science then contribute to the creation of a new Eurocentric vision of the world. A Eurocentric vision of the world where others do not have science. This is what distinguishes the West from the rest. And it becomes a tool during the Cold War. Well, I mean, and it's actually spearheaded by people like Conant, etc., who at the same time are reformulating the space of Europe itself by creating and consolidating the Iron Curtain on the one hand, and of redefining what the West actually meant. West was no longer Western Europe, but it was the Atlantic space, NATO. And this is what the West was all about then. And in this, of course, this is not a unified vision. We have two people who stand out in this. One who takes an orthogonal view of this position, although he espouses the scientific revolution, is Joseph Needham, who, as the Deputy Director General of UNESCO, the first Deputy Director of UNESCO under Julian Huxley, introduces the S in UNESCO for science, and at the same time, a program for spreading Western science or modern science, sorry, that's a slip of the tongue, to the rest of the world. And this, in part, is something that he integrates into his Science and Civilization in China, but also in The Great Titration. This idea that that science is basically like the sea, and every civilization, every culture has contributed to it. And now is the time, decolonization is the time when all this has to be returned to everyone. And so science is something, it's a public good and has to be part of, and has to be shared with everyone. The US loses no time in quashing any resolution which goes along these lines in the late 1940s and early 1950s in UNESCO in Paris. And instead of that, comes up with another vision, which is beautifully expressed in a short article by George Basala, another historian of science. And this is a landmark article called The Spread of Western Science, where Basala quite unabashedly states that science is restricted to the West. No one else ever had science. They could have, but it was proto-science that they, at best, that they had everywhere else in the world. And through his model, and later in the last half of the text, he puts forward a vision whereby the West needs to acculturate non-Westerners, bring them to the West, educate them, make them into little Western satellites to go back into their states and set up laboratories, set up teaching, but based on a purely Western model. So this is yet another vision of how science relates to the rest of the world. It's not as if science doesn't relate to the rest of the world. In all these models, science is something which is still implanted in the world, and it defines relationships between one part and another. Of course, and center periphery is yet another way in which this asymmetry is then conceived of. Now, the point is that lots of this, of course, led on the one hand to an acceptance of this in the West, but also strong reactions elsewhere in the world. The rise of a subdiscipline of the history of science, which is called Science and Empire, which also has its own autonomous representation in the Commission for the History of Science. Two landmark works in this. And so Science and Empire, essays in Indian context, and Science and Empire, and Science and Empires in the other case, which was a jointly edited book by Patrick Petitjean, Catherine Jamy, and Marie Moulin. And it was the aftermath of a large conference organized by UNESCO in 1992. And of course, a post-colonial take on this whole vision, which is another reason, science and the imagination of modern India, in which Gyan Prakash, a subaltern historian, pleads for an indigenous rationality in India, without ever defining what that means, but it's against Western rationality. Now, in what follows, so this is the way in which the history of science has actually been this is the history of science for most of the 20th century. Of course, mainstream history of science, although it radically changed in the 1970s from this universalist positivist view of Sarton and others to a much more localist vision, looking at science as a situated practice, something that Hans-Jörg Reinberger this morning actually very well delineated for us. And this emphasis on studying practice, experiment. On the other hand, none of this mainstream history of science was actually bothered about science in its wider context. Not as a domain of study, but yes, of belief, yes. Everyone's heart was in the right place, or rather in the left place. But never was this a question that was up for study. And this is where these other texts made place for themselves. Gyan Prakash, Science and Empire, and a lot many more, which I don't have time to go into. But this leads to a kind of a splintering of the space. So it's a fragmentation where different people present different things, and then one can plead for a space for other rationalities. And however, I don't know how much time I have left. Sorry, can...
Yeah, you still have about 10 minutes.
Okay, fine. Okay, so I'll really rush through the thing. So I would now like to look at a new playing field and move away from from the tenets of uh, the history of science as a domain. So one of these tenets, of course, is its founding principle, the founding principle of the history of science, which is the scientific revolution. Um, it's the equivalent somewhere of in history writing, in mainstream history writing, or at least European history, the marker between the Middle Ages and uh, later times was the marker was the Renaissance and the Reformation. Till about 30, 40 years ago, when historians began to change this thing, these markers, to redefine this period, to look at things which could not be fitted into either the Renaissance and especially not into the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. And they proposed the term early modern. Now, this term early modern has been taken up quite seriously within another school of, or rather new currents of thinking in history, in mainstream history, which are called relational histories, sometimes transnational, but here are a few of them. And I just like to pick up on one, which is connected histories, and one of the first papers on connected histories, which was by Sanjay Subramanian, in which Subramanian looks at the world, or presents us, argues for a new way of taking up this periodization of the early modern and looking at the early modern not just for Europe, but in a much wider context. And he says that although it was coined in the 1970s, he says that he defines this period now for himself and offers us this new definition, which is it's the emergence of a new sense of the limits of the inhabited world, entailing momentous changes in conceptions of space and cartography, and the emergence of new empirical ethnographies. And this is something which is shared not only by the Eurasian and Asian worlds, but also within Africa and in pre and post-Columbian Americas as well. And he says, so these are long-term structural conflicts between settled and urban agricultural groups on the one hand, and nomadic societies on the other, leading to large-scale effects on global trade flows. The large-scale African slave trade, for instance, cash crops, the emergence of the idea of a universal empire embodied in the projects of the Timurid tradition in Central Asia, the Spanish Habsburgs, pre-Columbian America, South and Central Africa, and the major trading companies, and eventually Britain. So, and there are the emergence of new notions of the individual and medical and biological knowledge, a new public space for culture, and critical political thought. These phenomena, as the list itself suggests, and a number of scholars have shown, were not limited to Western Europe, but were global in nature. So I would thus suggest that we adopt, for a start, the early modern as the period within which to study knowledge making on a global scale, and is against the loose term modern, which rings no bells for the period beyond the narrow bounds of our discipline, the history of science. Now, if we do this, then it also helps us to try and see what sorts of domains were being studied or preoccupied people in this period. And strangely enough, this list coincides pretty much with the activities of early modern savant or learned societies. So we find, I mean, if we really go through it, we find that geography, as Sanjay Subramaniam says, natural history, of course, medicine, ethnography, practical mathematics, navigation, various skilled practices such as plant collection, illustration, land surveying, cartography, mining, instrument making, and calibration are domains that you find largely spread across the whole of the globe in various ways. And we can see how it's through these practices that people are also coming together, and a new globalization is occurring precisely during this period. So I would like to finish with, and yes, so I'd like to finish with an example, looking at a case study. And I mean, unfortunately, Hans-Jörg is not here, but otherwise I would have suggested, since the question was raised this morning, what is a case study? There are a number of books also for Jim. One of them is Ponce par Cas, which is a landmark work on case studies, and case studies as a way of doing history, of looking at singular events and making sense of them. So it's edited by Jean-Claude Passeron and Jacques Revel. And the other one is Jeu d'échelle, la microanalyse à l'expérience, again by Jacques Revel. So I'd like to finish with this example. And this example is of the Hortus Indicus Malabaricus, a 12-volume herbal from South India, from the Malabar coast of southwestern India. So it is, if you all can see my cursor, it's this part of the Indian coast. And it's 12 volumes. It has about 790 illustrations of plants from this region. Here are some of them, the ones that be more familiar to you all. This work is really one of the most majestic contributions to natural history and to botany. It's become it was one of Linnaeus's biggest references for his own classifications. He worked on it a lot in Leiden, and so this work has not only these illustrations, but it has a description of each and every one of these 790 plants in Latin over the 12 volumes. So let me very, very quickly tell you about how it was done. Now, the person who commissioned it was this man, Hendrik Adriaan van Rede. I hope I'm pronouncing it okay. So he was not only a nobleman, but he was also the Dutch commander of the newly acquired territories in Cochin and in this part of India, which these territories they acquired by defeating the Portuguese. This part had been ruled by the Portuguese for 150 years previous to their arrival in 1663. And it's there that just a decade later, this work is made. Now, it's made because the Dutch East India Company sends a directive to all its settlements the world over, especially in Asia, asking them to catalog all the plants that might be useful, either for treating people in the Indian Ocean or elsewhere, or else even for markets in Europe. So it's an answer to this. But of course, I mean, Van Rede is not a botanist. He has no idea. He can't tell, as a friend of mine says, Christmas from Thursday, as far as botany goes. He's a military commander. He left the Netherlands at the age of 13 and has been floating around all over the world since then. So he knows more of the sea than he does of land. And he admits this right from the start in the preface. But of course, he says something over here, which on page 8 of the preface, which starts with ordinem, etc., which, if you translate, says this. It says, by my orders, Brahmins and other physicians made lists of the best known and most frequently occurring plants in their languages. On this basis, others classified the plants according to the season in which they attracted notice for their leaves or flowers or fruit. This seasonal catalogue was then given to experts in plants who were entrusted in groups of 3 with a collection of the plants with their leaves, flowers, and fruit, for which they even climbed the highest tops of trees. 3 or 4 draftsmen who stayed with me in a convenient place would accurately depict the living plants as the collectors brought them in. To these pictures, a description was added, nearly always in my presence. Now, one of the most surprising things is that when you open the first volume, the first 3 pages are very strange. You have these engravings and followed by Latin text. So this is the first. The second is this one, and the third is this one. Now, these are 3 affidavits. The first affidavit is by a man called Manuel Carneiro, who it turns out is a Roman Christian, but he belongs to the civil society of Cochin. He is a Malabari himself, but he's a linguist, a translator from Malayalam to Portuguese. So he knows how to do that, and that's what he does. He writes his affidavit, then he translates it into Portuguese, and from Portuguese it's translated by Christian Herman von der Nepp, who's the civil secretary of the Dutch administration in Cochin. The next one is by a local low-caste doctor. Now, he's not really a doctor. He is of the coconut palm climbing community. It's the Irava. And they are very good at distilling coconut alcohol. So they master distilling practices. And it's their practices that he brings into the use of various plants that he talks about. And over here, he describes the authenticity and the veracity. He swears to the authenticity and the veracity of what he's saying based on traditional knowledge. And then the last one is a joint affidavit by 3 people. This is in a completely different script from the 2 others. It's in the Nagari script of the northwestern coast of India. And over here, it's these 3 doctors who are big merchants and diplomats. And they're the ones who send out their servants. This is what the text actually says, to go and get the plants. And they're the ones who describe all the plants and their medicinal uses, along with Itti Achyutan, the author of the second affidavit. So, well, here they are. I don't have time to go into any of them, but what I'd like to say over here is that when you start looking at this, you see how you can reconstruct the making of knowledge on a global scale, and at the same time restitute power structures, asymmetries, the place of people in all this, and at the same time the agency of each and every one of them. So this is an example of a practice, and this is not the only one. I can pull out oodles of things like this, but for one thing, it was a good text to choose for Utrecht. And secondly, also to illustrate my point, to talk about the new playing field, which is just to move away from the scientific revolution and the way in which it defines what science is, to practices in something which the early modern can help us take account of. And the goalposts are then sort of not looking at laboratory practices or practices in closed spaces, the space, the traditional space that historians of science are used to looking at, but something else that that a colleague of mine over here, whom you might all know, Michel Calon, where he uses the term sciences de plein air, which means the open air sciences, which is not the sciences of the field, but sciences where we do not have individual civilities or sociabilities, but people who come from very, very different practices and who have to work together to do things. And how consensus then arises and how knowledge is then made. So, and of course, then there are new rules for doing this and the kinds of questions that one needs to ask for doing this. And I leave. Thanks a lot, and sorry for having taken up too much time.
No problem whatsoever. Very fascinating material, and fascinating material also for discussion. But before we move to discussion, we're of course eager to hear from James Poskett, to hear your comments and, if possible, Kapil's reply to it. So please, James, go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you again for inviting me and for a really stimulating day. I've been here in the afternoon. I was teaching this morning, and thank you to Kapil for a fascinating paper. I'm going to try and highlight a few things that I think are really helpful about Kapil's paper and maybe push a few things a bit further and ask some questions. So I mean, broadly, I'm extremely sympathetic to Kapil's approach to the history of science generally, and also his account of the historiography of the sciences, particularly the point about remembering that much of the early 20th century history of science had this kind of global cosmopolitan approach, and it was during the Cold War specifically that we got the invention of this idea of Western science through the process of the Cold War and decolonization. And therefore, the project of even the kind of history of science in the 80s and 90s towards these local histories was really a trend towards even more Eurocentrism rather than less. And of course, that's paralleled with many of the broader changes that were happening in history, where we get people like E.P. Thompson, who was also reading Evans Pritchard, to go back to earlier, writing these very local European, British, in fact, in that instance, or English even, centric histories. So I think that's well worth recalling, and Marwa El-Shakri's paper on When Science Became Western I have found continually useful over the last 10 years in reminding me of this. And therefore, as Kapil says, the challenge is really to think about how you write a history of science that is suitable for the world after the Cold War, yet presumably doesn't want to return to the old kind of early 20th century cosmopolitanism, one that also recognizes the kinds of power differences at play. And I, like Kapil, actually find Sanjay Subramanian's account of connected histories and more generally histories of circulation a useful way to start thinking about this. And I'm just going to talk a little bit more about the Van Reyder example, maybe as a way into this, because I think the Van Reyder example of the Hortus malabaricus is very helpful, but something that has not really been done with it, and that Richard Grove doesn't do really in his original account, is to start asking what made this possible in conceptual terms. So we have quite a few histories of science that do things a bit like the account that Kapil gave, where we say, well, there was this existing South Indian tradition of medicinal knowledge, and then it was translated a few times, and then it arrived in Europe, and Linnaeus used it. And so we can trace the origins of Linnaean classification to some kind of South Indian tradition. But another parallel question, I think, is, well, what did Van Reyder think he was doing? And indeed, in reverse, what did Ittyachidan think he was doing, or the Brahmin Pandits? What kind of conceptualization do you need to think it is plausible to take that knowledge from an existing tradition bound as it is with various kinds of practices and ideas, and bring it to Europe. And that's actually quite a profound thing to start doing that, to think that's possible. And broadly, I think you need to have a new conceptualization of what knowledge is, how knowledge is produced, and crucially, what kind of past what kind of present in relation to the past you're living in. So I think it requires a reconceptualization of history. To make this a little bit more concrete, so one of the things Van Rede does is he starts describing the palm leaf manuscripts as books. Now, clearly a palm leaf manuscript is not a book in the traditional sense Van Rede had in mind, but it's those kinds of ways in which people are not just translating languages, but translating between worlds that I think are really fundamental to early modern science. And that's again why I think Kappel's invocation of Sanjay Subramaniam's work is really helpful, because of course the early modern is a period in which people are reconceptualizing not only their relationship in space in terms of geography, but it's crucially a period in which people are reconceptualizing their relation to the past. And I think it's that reconceptualization to the past which is so fundamental and so important in making some of these knowledge transfers possible. Because of the other thing Van Rede does is explicitly starts talking about the Vedas as a source of medicinal and scientific knowledge. So it's in this period that Europeans start thinking about non-European traditions having a past that could be a source of knowledge. And that goes not just for South Asia, but also for the Americas, in East Asia, and elsewhere. So I think asking that kind of question about not just how it was done, not just what the practices were, but what kinds of conceptualizations are required to make this seem plausible to different parties, which relates very much to the discussions we were having earlier, both in Sunanset's talk and later. I think also, and the reason I'm talking a bit about this is because I've written about this in my forthcoming book, I think we can ask this question from the other side of the encounter. So to give kind of contemporaneous examples, we might ask what a Ming astronomer thinks he's doing when he's translating Euclid in the early 17th century, and what kind of understanding of the past and geography that is premised upon. Similarly, we might ask what an indigenous Mexica physician thinks he's doing when he's writing a medicinal in 16th century Mexico. What kind of conception of geography and the past that requires? And to round this off, my personal view is that the early modern is a good category, but something I found really helpful, and this kind of maybe runs slightly against Kappel's point, is the idea of the global Renaissance. So I unfortunately wasn't here when Peter Burke was here earlier, but Jack Goody's book about the Renaissances, but also more recent articles about the global Renaissance. My reading of the early modern period broadly is that there are lots of people around the world, for the reasons that Sanjay Subramaniam identifies, who are reconceptualizing their knowledge-making practices in the present by reconfiguring their understanding of the past. And so I think thinking more about the history of how people thought about histories of science in the past could be helpful. I suppose the other point, Kappel pushed the idea of the early modern very hard, and I feel like I'm not too fussed what you call it, to be honest, but it doesn't strike me that the early modern is particularly more solves any of the problems that the scientific revolution doesn't. I mean, in my history department, people are always complaining that the early modern is an artifact of kind of Western modernity, and we need to scrap this as an organization for our curriculum. which all sounds very reasonable to me. So on the one hand, I don't think we need to get too hung up about conceptual terms, but I'm not sure the early modern on its own solves things. And I think the reason that I'm not super keen on it is because I wasn't quite sure the actual chronology that Capel meant. And the most appealing version of the early modern, I heard someone say the sort of very, very longue durée early modern, by which they meant something like the year 1000 to 1800. I think I'm okay with that. But I think if early modern means kind of 1400 to the French Revolution still, then it's not going to help historians of science do that kind of global work. The final point I want to make, and this came out slightly in Capel's talk and even more so in his article in the Journal of Early Modern History a few years ago, is I think for the global history of science to be a success, we do need to reckon with the place of area studies in our discipline. There's been a real resurgence in area studies in the last 10 years or so, and this is a really good thing in many ways. There is much more work on the world beyond Europe, and there are many more people working with the linguistic expertise required to do that kind of detailed work. But many of the programmatic statements of the global history of science kind of problematized area studies really strongly, and I think for good reason. And of course, area studies, more than anything else, is a product of the Cold War. So I do sometimes worry that the history of science still looks a bit like a version of the history of science the CIA would be perfectly comfortable with, and indeed would find quite useful. And that, of course, reflects the dominance of a certain kind of Anglo-American orientation in the discipline itself. All that said, I think there are examples of people who have either been trained in or coming out of area studies who are very conscious of that and are actively trying to work beyond that. But that is really difficult in terms of careers, I think particularly in North America, but also increasingly in Britain, where jobs are often advertised as area studies jobs. And it's very difficult if you're trying to straddle both kind of area studies and global history. But I will just give two examples of works that I think do this really successfully. I think Elise Burton's recent book on genetic crossroads is absolutely exemplary in terms of how it melds an area studies approach with a genuine global history approach, cutting across areas. And similarly, I think Abina Dove Aseo Asare's Atomic Junction does this equally well for the sub-Saharan African context in the way that African history is situated within a global history as well. So I think it's possible, but I think that's a real challenge for global histories of science. I'll wrap up there. Thanks very much. It feels a bit like when I'm doing talks to my seminars with my students where I'm